My name is Ted, and if you don't mind, I'm going to sit here for a minute while the sky is still just starting to turn. Because there's something I've been thinking about lately that doesn't leave easily once it settles in your mind. It's about a man named Alaric Boone, someone most people would quietly respect without ever making a big deal out of it. The kind of person who did exactly what he was supposed to do year after year, never cutting corners, never chasing shortcuts, just steadily building toward what everyone calls a secure retirement. By the time he reached his early 60s, he had about $2 million set aside, which on paper should have meant he was done. But when he passed away at 88, that number had grown to nearly $6 million, and almost none of it had been used to actually live. So the question isn't what went wrong, it's why nothing seemed wrong at all. If you had met Alaric around 62, nothing about his life would have looked incomplete because he had already taken care of the things most people spend decades worrying about, from owning his home outright, to keeping his expenses predictable, to building that $2 million portfolio that sat there like a quiet safety net under everything else. And when you think about what retirement is supposed to represent, that's usually the moment people are aiming for, the point where the pressure to accumulate fades and something else is supposed to begin. Because when you apply something like the 4% rule, which in simple terms means you can withdraw around 4% of your portfolio each year and adjust that for inflation while still making it last, Alaric could have taken about $80,000 annually and reasonably expected that to support him across a 30-year retirement. In real life, that's not just enough. It's flexibility. It's the ability to choose how you spend your time instead of having your time chosen for you. But instead of stepping into that, he told himself something that didn't sound like hesitation in the moment, something that felt measured and practical. Just one more year. And what made it dangerous wasn't the decision itself. It was how easily it repeated. Because when you say one more year, it doesn't feel like delay. It feels like control, especially when the math seems to support you, when you can picture your portfolio growing another 10% or even 20%, when there's still income coming in, still contributions being made, still progress you can point to. And in that mindset, stopping starts to feel like giving something up, even if what you're gaining in return is time. But what begins to happen slowly and almost invisibly is that every number you reach stops feeling like an endpoint and starts becoming the new baseline you measure everything else against. And once that baseline moves, your sense of enough moves with it, which means the decision to stop never quite feels aligned with how you see your situation. So Alaric kept going not out of necessity, but because the finish line kept shifting just far enough to justify staying. And this is where the reality underneath the surface starts to matter more than the story you're telling yourself. Because while he believed he was reducing risk, the data behind his situation was pointing somewhere else entirely. Research from Michael Kitches examined retirees who followed the 4% rule over long periods, and instead of finding that people gradually ran out of money, it found something that feels counterintuitive at first, which is that many portfolios actually grew over time, often ending with nearly 3 times their starting value after a 30-year retirement. So if you apply that to Alaric starting at $2 million, the expectation wasn't depletion, it was growth, potentially reaching somewhere between $5,500,000 and $6 million, even while he was withdrawing from it. And once you see that, it changes the entire context, because it means the outcome he was trying to avoid was never the most likely one. He wasn't protecting himself from running out. He was building a surplus he would never fully use. And then there's another layer that doesn't get talked about as often, which is how spending actually behaves over time. Because while models assume spending rises alongside inflation at around 3%, real life tends to follow a different curve. Early in retirement spending is higher as people take advantage of their health and energy. Then it gradually declines through their 70s before increasing again later, often due to healthcare needs. On average, spending tends to increase by about 2%, not 3%. And while that difference might seem small, it compounds over decades into something meaningful. It means people consistently underspend relative to what their portfolios could support, which means Alaric wasn't just saving too much, he was also living too little. At this point, it would be easy to frame everything as a misunderstanding of numbers, as if better information alone could have led to a different outcome. But that misses the deeper layer of what was really happening, because the barrier he faced wasn't just about what he knew, it was about who he had become over time. For decades, Alaric had built a life around saving, around delaying gratification, around making decisions that prioritized future security over present experience. And those patterns didn't just disappear when the conditions changed because they had become part of his identity. And when retirement asked him to reverse that pattern, to stop accumulating and start drawing down, to trust that what he had built was enough, it didn't feel like a natural transition. It felt like stepping into something uncertain. So even after he stopped working, the mindset didn't fully shift because he still approached his money as something to protect, something to preserve, rather than something to use as a tool for living. And over time, without any dramatic turning point, something subtle but significant took shape. His resources kept expanding, but his life didn't expand with them. When you look at Alaric's story from a distance, it's clear that there wasn't a single moment where everything changed, because what defined the outcome was a pattern that felt reasonable every step of the way, a series of small decisions that made sense individually but led somewhere unexpected when you put them together. Just one more year. It's a simple idea, but repeated over time, it becomes a way of postponing the very phase of life you spent decades preparing for. And that's why the real shift isn't about reaching a higher number. It's about understanding what that number is supposed to support in the first place. Because once you have clarity around what you're actually retiring to, how your income aligns with that, how your investments and taxes fit into a sustainable plan, the question of whether it's enough starts to settle into something more concrete. And when that happens, you stop chasing the next milestone, and you start paying attention to what you already have. So if you're somewhere between 55 and 65, standing at that point where retirement is no longer theoretical, but something that's starting to feel real, it might be worth stepping back for a moment and asking yourself a different question than the one you've been repeating. Because the risk in front of you might not be running out of money, even though that's the one most people focus on. It might be running out of time while holding on to money you never fully allowed yourself to use. And if you already had $2 million today, sitting there as a foundation for whatever comes next, the question might not be whether you can afford to stop. It might be what you're still waiting for. If this made you think differently, like, share, and subscribe so more people don't waste time chasing money they won't use.